Hey y'all, welcome back to Antiracist Newbie. One of the things that really keeps me going in the work of understanding my power and privilege is that if you're willing to stay curious and be open to feedback and new information and looking at old things in new ways, you will find daily, sometimes multiple times a day, way that you hold privilege that you maybe never even considered before. And the last anti-racist newbie that I posted was the Wild Horse Lake version. And in that I talked about how important it is for white folks, for me, as I'm becoming anti-racist, because it's not about waking up tomorrow and being woke. I talked about the importance of not doing this work alone. Whether you're in a cohort, whether you have a white accountability partner, whether you're paying an anti-racist coach, it's really hard to do alone because so much of the work is about seeing ourselves and how our racism, our internalized racism, and the racist systems around us work. And it's pretty hard to see those things in isolation. And I talked about the importance of therapy. And that came up partly because as I've been more vocal around my observations of how racism shows up in professional spaces, sometimes I do that effectively, and sometimes I do that leading with empathy, and sometimes I do that in ways that is much more related to my own past trauma than about providing anything useful. And so I talked about the role that therapy has played in my life in helping me understand myself, understand my nervous system, understand my feelings, understand my trauma, understand my relationships. I have had largely a very positive relationship with therapy over the 20 plus years that I've seen multiple different clinicians, both alone and in couples therapy. And today I was talking to a friend who reminded me of what an incredible privilege therapy is. So let's talk a little bit about my access to mental health services and to counseling in particular. I had health insurance through my parents until I was in my mid-20s. And then I've had health insurance be a part of the jobs that I've been able to work since I was in my mid-20s. Sometimes those health insurance plans were really robust and I had really small copays. Other times I've had to pay a significant copay, but I've always had health insurance. And certainly being insured is an enormous privilege that in the United States is still not available to all of our citizens. So there's the fact that I've had health insurance. Then there's also the fact that as a white woman, it has never, ever been hard for me to find my therapist of choice, which is another white woman. And I have had male therapists who have been white, and I have had women who are social workers trained like I am. And yes, sometimes there have been wait lists, but if I am to look through the panel of therapists available on my health insurance, it is not hard to find one that looks a lot like me. That is not the case for a lot of folks. If I'm Black, if I'm Latinx, if I am any kind of person of color, if I am queer, it will be a lot harder to find therapists or counselors who look and sound and experience the world in similar ways that I do. Doesn't mean that those therapists are not out there. It just means that there's a lot less of them, and that the social work and helping fields are still dominated by white folks. So another privilege is that I can find a white therapist to work with. I will also say that even though I'm educated, even though I'm trained in particular as a healthcare social worker, that when you are, I'll keep it me, when I am feeling depressed, when I am feeling anxious, when I am deep within my own pain and my own suffering and my own trauma, it is incredibly hard to have the motivation and the wherewithal to deal with going online, finding a therapist that's within your zip code, finding one that's accepting new patients, finding one that's accepting your insurance. That requires an incredible amount of fortitude and tenacity. And if you're in need of a therapist or counselor, you might not be feeling like you have a lot of self-agency or motivation or tenacity. And so the other privilege that I've had is that I have friends who help me do this. I have family that helps me do this. I have a partner that helps me do this. I have an education and an understanding of how the system works. And even despite all of those privileges, it's still really, really hard to locate a therapist that has openings. Then once you've actually found that person who will take your insurance and isn't on the other side of town, there is the fact that I have my own car, not just one. My husband and I have two. That I have the mode of transportation to get to my therapist. That I don't need to rely on a public system to get me to any office that I've needed to get to. That as an able-bodied person, I do not have to ask if there's a ramp to get into the office. I do not have to consider other parts of the environment that could limit me, that would not be accessible, because I don't have to think about those things. Able-bodied privilege showing up there. I also have either worked for myself or worked in occupations where I have the ability to say, I will not be available over my lunch break. I will not be available at 3 o'clock. I must leave today by 4:30. I have a medical appointment. And that has never, not one time in the 20 plus years that I've worked, has that ever been questioned. And that is an enormous privilege of working in professional occupations, which is related to my class and education. How many people are in desperate need of support and therapy and do not have a job or a boss or understanding colleagues that would allow for folks to go to therapy during the middle of the day. Okay, so there's that. Then there's childcare. Not such an issue for me as a married person who has a partner who can watch my kids when I go to therapy. But I will say that the years that I've done couples therapy, my children, because they were younger then, stayed with my parents. And there were no questions asked. I didn't have to pay for that child care. That could be in the middle of the day or in the evenings, or if I would have wanted it to be on the weekends, that would have been available. So the fact that I have family in town to watch my children while my husband and I go to therapy that we can afford with someone that looks like us, you can quickly see how much privilege is wrapped up in my desire to work with an educated clinician to do traditional talk therapy with me. Once I'm in that office, I know that most of the practitioners, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the social workers, are folks that probably share my race. I know that the theorists, that the academics, that the researchers probably share my race. I do not have the baggage that a lot of people of color do, particularly Black Americans, who have very little reason to trust a healthcare system. I am not going to ever walk into a therapist's office and think that they may be using me without my permission as part of a research project. And if that ever came to be, I would know that I would have attorneys immediately at my disposal to sue their asses, because that would not be right. That has not been the case for African Americans in this country who have a long history of being used against their will as part of medical or academic research. And it doesn't matter how long ago that happened, that trauma, that mistrust is passed on because it needs to be. And then let's also talk about how, even as a white person, that the current healthcare system, which includes behavioral sciences, how deeply embedded it is in the patriarchy and very paternalistic tendencies to have the doctor or the psychiatrist or the helper be beyond question, be in a position of power, regardless of how they use that power, regardless of their fantastic bedside manner. There is still a very, very glaringly obvious hierarchy between patient and doctor, between client and therapist. And I know within the field of social work, I certainly know that trying to figure out how to distribute that power and how to be more transparent and how to be more, to lessen the distinction between one up and one down. I know within that field we're trying to do a better job, but at the end of the day, it's the therapist who is still looking through the DSM-5 to say, Lori, I believe you have this diagnosis and I have to give you the label because the only way that I get paid is if I follow this deeply patriarchal system and assign you with a problem. And there's all sorts of ways that I can make that feel less patriarchal, but that's still how the system works. As a white person, I know what it's like to not want to be given a label that doesn't feel right for me, or to be given a label that's limiting. And so for folks that are part of any marginalized group, the amount of fear and discomfort around those labels, and the fear that those labels from my mental health records could in any way potentially make it back to my employer or make it back to some other system that could use that information against me, is it any wonder that a lot of marginalized groups are super hesitant to use traditional talk therapy? So just wanted to share those thoughts with you and acknowledge that in the last video I made when I suggested therapy, what a place of privilege that was coming from. For my white allies who have utilized or will utilize traditional talk therapy, to be able to acknowledge that that's a privilege that we have, and to also recognize that that remains an option that may not feel like an obvious option to a lot of Black and Indigenous people of color, to queer folks, to folks living with any kind of disability. And to use this as a challenge to think today about one benefit, about one thing that might come easy to you, about one thing that you hardly have to think about and you've maybe never thought about as a privilege before, to open yourself up to maybe what that observation could be, and to share that with somebody else that you know, so that we can become more aware of the privilege that we have, not to shut us down in guilt, but so that we can learn to understand the power. And it's not until we understand our power that we can begin to think about how we dismantle really broken systems and how we pull ourselves apart from those oppressive systems. Be well. Thanks for doing the work. And again, I'm not perfect at this. I screw it up every day. And I really encourage your comments and feedback about how I screwed it up in this episode.